The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, throwing Grace Richardson forward against the worn wooden seat as the driver's panicked shout pierced the thick Missouri air. She scrambled to steady herself, her heart hammering as dust billowed through the windows and the unmistakable crack of rifle fire echoed across the prairie. It was July 1875, and Grace had traveled over 800 miles from Philadelphia to reach St. Joseph, Missouri, carrying nothing but 2 battered trunks, a letter from a dead aunt she'd never met, and the desperate hope that the small dress shop mentioned in that letter still existed. Bandits. The driver yelled from above, and Grace heard the thunder of hooves approaching fast. Through the grimy window, she glimpsed at least 4 riders bearing down on the coach, their faces covered with dusty bandanas. Her fingers tightened on the small reticule in her lap, where she'd hidden what little money remained from selling everything she'd owned back east. The inheritance she'd hoped for had turned out to be nothing more than a failing business and debts, but it was still more than she'd had in Philadelphia, where the factory work had been slowly killing her spirit along with her health. Another shot rang out, and the stagecoach jerked into motion again, the driver whipping the horses into a desperate gallop. Grace was thrown against the side panel, her bonnet flying off as the coach careened wildly down the rutted road. The other passenger, an elderly man who'd barely spoken during the journey, was praying loudly, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather strap above his head. Through the chaos and dust, Grace caught sight of another rider, this one coming from the opposite direction. He sat tall in the saddle atop a magnificent Palomino horse, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. As he drew closer, she saw him draw a rifle from the scabbard on his saddle with fluid precision, the kind of movement that spoke of years of practice. He fired twice in rapid succession, and she heard one of the bandits cry out. The pursuing outlaws suddenly veered off, apparently deciding the stagecoach wasn't worth tangling with an armed man who knew how to shoot. The coach began to slow, the horses blowing hard from their sprint. Grace's entire body trembled as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She could have died on this dusty Missouri road before ever seeing the town that was supposed to be her new beginning. The stagecoach came to a complete stop, and she heard the stranger's voice, deep and calm, speaking to the driver. "Everyone all right up there, Hank?" "Thanks to you, Zane," the driver called back, his voice still shaky. "Damn vulture's been working this stretch for near about 2 weeks now. Sheriff hasn't been able to catch them yet." Grace smoothed her travel-worn skirt and tried to collect herself as the coach door swung open. The man who'd saved them stood there, and she got her first clear look at him. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that touched his collar. His eyes were a striking blue-gray, sharp and assessing but not unkind. A day's worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw, and dust coated his worn denims and leather vest. Everything about him spoke of a man who belonged to this wild country. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he looked at her. "You hurt?" Grace found her voice, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "No, I am fine. Thank you for your help." "Those men would have best not to think about what they would have done," he said quietly. His gaze moved to the elderly man. "Sir, you all right?" The man nodded vigorously. "Bless you, young man. Truly God sent you to us." The stranger, Zane, looked faintly uncomfortable with the praise. He stepped back and gestured down the road. "St. Joe's just another 3 miles up ahead. I will ride alongside until you all get there safely. Hank, take it slow. No need to risk breaking an axle now." "Will do, Zane." "Much obliged," the driver called down. Before Zane could close the door, Grace leaned forward. "Sir, might I know your full name? I would like to properly thank you once we reach town." He paused, and something flickered in his eyes. Up close, she could see the faint scar that traced along his left cheekbone and the lines around his eyes from squinting into too many sunsets. "Zane Ingram, madam. But no thanks necessary. Just doing what any decent person would." "I am Grace Richardson," she said, extending her hand through the doorway. He looked surprised but took it, his grip firm but careful, his palm rough with calluses. The touch sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. "And I disagree. Not everyone would have risked themselves for strangers." His expression softened just slightly. "Welcome to Missouri, Miss Richardson. Hope the rest of your stay is calmer than your arrival." He closed the door gently and swung back up onto his horse with easy grace. As the coach started moving again at a more sedate pace, Grace found herself watching through the window as he took up position riding alongside them. There was something solid and reassuring about his presence, something that made the vast emptiness of the prairie seem a little less intimidating. The elderly man across from her had stopped praying and was mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "That's Zane Ingram," he said, though she already knew. "Works the Rocking I Ranch north of town. Good man, from what I hear. Lost his parents to cholera about 5 years back. Has been running the ranch himself ever since. Him and a couple of hired hands." Grace filed that information away, watching as Zane scanned the horizon constantly, that rifle still held ready across his saddle. She wondered what kind of life shaped a man into someone so watchful, so ready for violence yet so quick to help. The factories and narrow streets of Philadelphia had prepared her for many hardships, but nothing like this landscape where danger could come thundering out of the prairie dust without warning. St. Joseph gradually came into view, sprawling along the eastern bank of the Missouri River. It was larger than Grace had expected, a bustling frontier town that had grown fat on the river trade and the steady stream of pioneers heading west. The streets were wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings that looked like stage sets propped up against the endless sky. Signs advertised everything from dry goods to gambling halls, from hotels to hardware. Wagons rattled past loaded with supplies, and men on horseback navigated through the traffic with casual skill. The stagecoach pulled up in front of the depot, a sturdy brick building that seemed more permanent than much of the town around it. Grace gathered her reticule and waited as the door opened. Zane was there again, offering his hand to help her down. She accepted, grateful for the steadiness as her legs wobbled slightly after hours of travel and the shock of the attack. "Where are you headed, Miss Richardson?" Zane asked as the driver and his assistant began unloading luggage from the top of the coach. "Got someone meeting you." Grace shook her head, suddenly feeling very alone in this strange town. "No, I am looking for a dress shop or what used to be one. It belonged to my aunt, Constance Miller. She passed away several months ago and I inherited it. I hope to reopen it." Zane's eyebrows rose slightly. "Constance Miller's place, on 3rd Street. You knew her." "Everyone knew Miss Constance," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice now. "She made my mother's wedding dress and my sister's christening gown. Good woman. I was sorry to hear of her passing." He paused and his expression grew concerned. "But Miss Richardson, that shop's been closed up for months now, might not be in good condition." Grace's heart sank, but she lifted her chin. She'd come too far to be deterred by a little disrepair. "Then I will have to remedy that, won't I?" Something that might have been approval flickered in Zane's eyes. "I suppose you will." He turned and pointed down the main street. 3rd Street is 3 blocks that way, runs parallel to the river. The shop has a faded blue door, can't miss it. It is between the general store and the barber shop. "Thank you," Grace said. She looked around at her 2 trunks, now sitting in the dust beside the coach, and realized she had no idea how she was going to get them to the shop. A porter, perhaps, though that would cost money she could barely spare. Zane seemed to read her thoughts. "I can load those in my wagon and bring them to the shop for you. I need to pick up some supplies anyway, and it is not out of my way." Grace's pride warred with her practicality. She didn't want to seem helpless, didn't want to be a burden on this stranger who'd already done so much. But the trunks were heavy, and she was exhausted, and she'd learned the hard way that sometimes accepting help was not weakness but wisdom. "I would be very grateful, Mr. Ingram, though I insist on paying you for your trouble." "No need," he said firmly. "Consider it a welcome to St. Joe." He glanced at the position of the sun. "Give me about 20 minutes to get my wagon. You could wait at the hotel lobby there if you'd like. Get out of this heat." Grace nodded, and Zane tipped his hat to her before heading off down the street, leading his palomino. She watched him go, noting how people greeted him as he passed, how he seemed to know everyone and they him. This was his world, these dusty streets and weathered buildings, this place where the frontier still pressed close and danger rode alongside daily life. She made her way to the hotel, a 3-story building with a wide porch and rocking chairs. The lobby was blessedly cool, and she sank into one of the chairs, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The clerk behind the desk nodded to her politely, and she nodded back, trying to look like someone who belonged here, someone who wasn't terrified and uncertain and completely out of her depth. Through the window, she watched the life of the town flow past. Cowboys in dusty chaps and jingling spurs, businessmen in suits that looked out of place in this rough setting, women in practical calico dresses carrying baskets, children running barefoot through the street. A freight wagon rumbled by, pulled by a team of massive oxen. Somewhere a dog barked, and piano music drifted from one of the saloons despite it being early afternoon. This was her home now. Philadelphia was 800 miles and a lifetime away. There was no going back, even if she'd wanted to. She'd sold everything, burned every bridge, gambled everything on this inheritance that might be nothing more than a derelict building and broken dreams. True to his word, Zane appeared 20 minutes later driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 stocky horses. Grace hurried out to meet him. He'd already loaded her trunks into the back, handling them as if they weighed nothing. "Ready?" he asked, and she nodded. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, and she arranged her skirts as he climbed up beside her. Being this close to him, she caught the scent of leather and horse and sunshine, something clean and masculine that was entirely different from the coal smoke and factory oil that had permeated everything back in Philadelphia. He clicked his tongue to the horses, and they moved off at a steady walk. "How long you planning to stay?" Zane asked as they turned onto 3rd Street. "Permanently, I hope," Grace said. "There is nothing left for me back east." She hadn't meant to sound so bleak, but the words came out flat and final. Zane glanced at her, but whatever he saw in her face made him not press for details. "St. Joe's a good town, mostly, growing fast. Lots of people passing through, heading west or coming back from failed claims. Always need for goods and services." He paused. "Dress shop might do well. The ladies have been making do with catalog orders or sewing their own since your aunt passed." "You know why she left it to me?" Grace asked. "I never met her, didn't even know she existed until the lawyer's letter arrived." "Constance never married, never had children," Zane said thoughtfully. "Kept to herself mostly, though she was always kind. I recall hearing she had family back east, but I don't think they kept in touch much. Maybe you were all she had left." That thought made Grace inexplicably sad. To live your whole life in this frontier town, building a business, making wedding dresses and christening gowns, and then to die alone with no one closer than a niece you'd never met. She vowed silently that whatever happened, she wouldn't let Constance's memory fade entirely. The shop would live again, if she had anything to say about it. The wagon stopped in front of a narrow building wedged between a bustling general store and a barber shop with a red and white pole. The blue paint on the door had faded to almost gray, and the windows were coated with dust. A sign above the door read Miller's Dress Shop in letters that had once been gilt, but were now peeling. The building looked sad and neglected, like a flower wilting in the harsh prairie sun. Grace climbed down from the wagon before Zane could help her, standing in the street and staring at her inheritance. It wasn't much, but it was hers, perhaps the first thing that had ever truly been hers. "Got a key?" Zane asked, jumping down beside her. Grace fumbled in her reticule and pulled out the large iron key that had come with the lawyer's letter. Her hand trembled slightly as she fitted it into the lock. It turned with a grinding protest, and the door swung inward on creaking hinges. The interior was dim, the dusty windows letting in only weak gray light. As Grace's eyes adjusted, she saw bolts of fabric stacked on shelves, a dress form standing like a ghost in the corner, a long cutting table, a sewing machine under a canvas cover, spools of thread in a rainbow of colors. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and there was a musty smell of disuse, but the bones of the shop were good, sturdy, real. Zane carried her trunks in one at a time, setting them against the far wall. "There's living quarters upstairs," he said, pointing to a narrow staircase at the back of the shop. "2 rooms and a small kitchen, if I remember right, probably in similar shape to down here." Grace nodded, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she'd taken on. This building needed cleaning, the shop needed inventory and organization. She needed to learn the business, attract customers, make money to live on. And she was one woman, alone, who'd spent her whole life in a factory sewing shirt sleeves, not creating entire garments. "Hey," Zane said quietly, and she realized she must have looked as panicked as she felt. "It is not as bad as it seems right now. Place is solid. Just needs some attention." "I don't know the first thing about running a dress shop," Grace admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I can sew, but factory work is different from this. I can't do calculations in my head quickly. I've never handled money or customers or—" She stopped, hearing the hysteria creeping into her voice. Zane was quiet for a moment, then he said, "My sister Rebecca lives in town with her husband. She knew your aunt pretty well, used to help out in the shop sometimes when she was younger. I bet she'd be willing to give you some guidance. And the shopkeeper next door, Mr. Patterson, is a decent fellow. He will help you get your bearings if you ask." Grace took a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. "I apologize. I am normally more composed. It has been a very long day." "You were nearly robbed, and now you are standing in a dusty shop 1,000 miles from everything you know," Zane said. "I'd say you are entitled to feel a bit overwhelmed." He glanced out the window at the lowering sun. "Look, I need to get back to the ranch before dark, but I can come by tomorrow morning if you'd like. Help you get the place cleaned up a bit, maybe check to make sure the building's sound. No charge," he added quickly, seeing her about to protest. "Just being neighborly." "Why are you being so kind to me?" Grace asked. The question came out more blunt than she'd intended, but she genuinely wanted to know. In Philadelphia, nobody did anything without expecting something in return. Zane looked surprised by the question. "Because you need help and I can give it. That is reason enough, isn't it?" He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "Out here, people rely on each other. The land's too hard, the life's too rough to make it alone. Your aunt understood that. She helped plenty of folks over the years, including my family. Seems right to return the favor to her kin." There was such simple honesty in his words that Grace felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "Then yes, I would appreciate your help tomorrow, Mr. Ingram. Thank you." "Zane," he corrected gently. "Out here we don't stand much on formality." "Grace," she offered in return, and he smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, more approachable. "Grace," he repeated, as if testing how her name felt. "I will see you tomorrow morning then. There's a boarding house 2 streets over if you need a meal or a bath tonight. Mrs. Chen runs it. Tell her I sent you and she will take good care of you." After Zane left, Grace stood in the silent shop for a long moment, dust motes swirling in the fading light. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She found a broom in a corner closet and began sweeping, the rhythmic motion soothing her frayed nerves. Dust flew everywhere, making her cough, but she kept at it, determined to at least clear a path through the shop before night fell completely. She explored the upstairs rooms, finding them much as Zane had described. 2 bedrooms, both small but adequate, and a kitchen area with a cast iron stove and a dry sink. The furniture was simple but serviceable, covered in sheets that had once been white but were now gray with dust. There was a strange intimacy to walking through her aunt's private spaces, seeing the careful way she'd arranged things, the small touches that spoke of a solitary but not unhappy life. On the kitchen table, Grace found a leather-bound ledger. She carried it to the window where the last light lingered and opened it carefully. Page after page of neat entries in a flowing hand, recording orders and payments, supplies purchased and delivered. The last entry was dated November 1874, 8 months ago. Grace traced her aunt's handwriting with one finger, this connection to a woman she'd never known but who'd given her a lifeline when she'd needed one most. By the time true darkness fell, Grace was exhausted beyond measure. She managed to get one bed uncovered and beat the worst of the dust from the mattress and linens. The thought of venturing out to find the boarding house Zane had mentioned was too daunting, so she ate the last of the bread and cheese she'd bought at the last stage stop, drank water from the pump out back that thankfully still worked, and collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. She fell asleep to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town settling for the night. Horses whinnying in distant corrals, piano music and laughter from the saloons, the whistle of a late riverboat on the Missouri. And despite her exhaustion and uncertainty, despite being more alone than she'd ever been in her life, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Morning arrived with bright sunlight streaming through the grimy windows and the sound of wagons rumbling past on the street below. Grace woke disoriented, her body stiff from sleeping in her clothes. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, then it all came rushing back. Missouri, St. Joseph. The dress shop, Zane. She found a pitcher and basin in one of the bedrooms and did her best to wash, though the water was cold and she had no proper soap. She changed into a fresh dress, a simple gray cotton that wouldn't show the dust she knew she'd be collecting, and pinned her dark blonde hair into a sensible bun. Looking at herself in the spotted mirror, she saw a woman who looked older than her 22 years, shadows under her green eyes, worry lines already forming between her brows. The factories had aged her prematurely, and the stress of the past months hadn't helped. Downstairs, she resumed sweeping where she'd left off the night before. In the daylight, she could see more clearly what the shop had been and could be again. The shelves were well built, the cutting table solid oak. The sewing machine was a newer model, a real treasure. The fabric that remained was dusty, but much of it still usable. Constance had built something good here, something worth preserving. Grace was sorting through bolts of calico when she heard a knock at the door. She looked up to see Zane peering through the window, a toolbox in one hand. Despite everything weighing on her mind, she felt her spirits lift at the sight of him. She hurried to unlock the door. "Good morning." "Morning," Zane replied, stepping inside. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, his face freshly shaved, his hair still damp. He wore work clothes, but they were cleaner than the dusty outfit from the stage robbery. "I brought some tools, figured there might be repairs needed." "I haven't had a chance to check everything thoroughly," Grace admitted. "I've mostly just been trying to sweep out the worst of the dust." Zane set down his toolbox and looked around with a practical eye. "Let me check the structure first, make sure there's nothing urgent. Then I can help with the cleaning if you'd like." He moved through the shop methodically, testing floorboards, examining the walls, checking the windows and door frames. Grace tried to continue sorting fabric, but she found herself watching him instead. There was something fascinating about the way he worked, completely focused, his strong hands testing joints and hinges with practiced efficiency. He belonged in this world of wood and iron and physical work in a way she was still learning. "Building solid," Zane announced after completing his circuit. "Roof looks good, no leaks I can see. Some of the window frames could use fresh caulking before winter, and that bottom step on the stairs is a bit loose, but nothing serious. Your aunt took good care of the place." "That's a relief," Grace said. "I was worried there might be major problems I couldn't afford to fix." Zane picked up a spare broom and started sweeping the corners she hadn't reached yet. "So what's your plan? Just reopen exactly as it was, or do you have ideas of your own?" Grace considered the question as she resumed sorting fabric, creating piles of usable and unusable material. "I suppose I'll start by cleaning, taking inventory, and learning what I can from my aunt's records. Then I'll let people know the shop is reopening. Beyond that," she shrugged helplessly. "I'm making this up as I go, to be honest." "Sounds about right for St. Joe," Zane said with a hint of amusement. "Most people here are making it up as they go. It is the frontier, after all." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the shop gradually emerging from its dusty cocoon. Grace found herself sneaking glances at Zane, wondering about him. He'd spoken briefly of losing his parents, of running a ranch. But what did that life look like day to day? What did he think about? What did he want? What made him ride to the rescue of a stranger's stagecoach? "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure," Zane replied, dumping a dustpan full of debris into the crate they were using for trash. "Yesterday when you drove off those bandits, wasn't that dangerous? They had guns. There were several of them." Zane paused, leaning on the broom handle. "I suppose so. But what was I supposed to do, ride on by and let them rob you, maybe hurt you or worse?" He shook his head. "Some things you do because they're right, regardless of the risk." "That's very noble," Grace said quietly, "but also a good way to get killed, maybe." Zane met her eyes directly. "But my father always said a man who won't stand up when standing is needed isn't much of a man at all. I'd rather take the risk than live as a coward." There was no bravado in his words, just simple conviction. Grace thought about the men she'd known back east, factory owners who'd worked children to exhaustion for pennies, foremen who'd looked the other way when the machinery was dangerous, men who'd proposition a woman and then pretend they'd done nothing wrong when she refused. She couldn't imagine any of them risking themselves for strangers. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," she said. Zane's expression softened with memory. "He was. Both my parents were good people. The cholera took them within days of each other back in '70. I was 19, Rebecca was 16. We made it through, but some days I'm still not sure how." "I'm sorry," Grace said and meant it. "I lost my mother when I was 12. My father remarried quickly and my stepmother never wanted me around. She made that very clear. I started working at the factory as soon as they'd take me, just to get out of the house. She hadn't meant to share that, but something about Zane invited confidence. He didn't respond with empty platitudes or awkward sympathy. He just nodded, understanding in his eyes, and went back to sweeping. The door opened, making both of them look up. A woman swept in, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pinned up elaborately and a dress that spoke of money and taste. She was beautiful in a sharp-edged way, her dark eyes taking in the shop, Grace, and Zane with calculating speed. "Well," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent Grace couldn't quite place. "So it's true. Constance's long-lost niece has arrived to claim her inheritance." Grace straightened, immediately on guard. There was something hostile in the woman's tone. "I'm Grace Richardson, and you are?" "Vivian Sutton. I own the millinery shop 2 streets over." Vivian moved deeper into the shop, her skirts rustling. "I was a friend of your aunt's, or as much of a friend as Constance allowed anyone to be." "It's nice to meet someone who knew her," Grace said carefully. "I'm hoping to learn about her as I get the shop running again." "Running again?" Vivian's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "You plan to reopen? How ambitious! And do you have experience in dressmaking, Miss Richardson?" "I was a seamstress in Philadelphia," Grace said, lifting her chin slightly. "Factory work, yes, but I know how to sew." "Factory work?" Vivian's tone made it clear what she thought of that. "How quaint. Well, I'm sure you'll do your best, though I should warn you the standards here are quite high. Constance was exceptionally talented. She'll be hard to replace." "I'm not trying to replace her," Grace said, feeling her temper start to rise. "I'm trying to honor her memory by continuing her work." Vivian's eyes slid to Zane, who'd been watching the exchange with a carefully neutral expression. "Zane, darling, I didn't expect to see you in town today." "Don't you have a ranch to run?" "Taking a day to help a neighbor," Zane said evenly, seemed more important. Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, quickly masked. "How kind of you. You always were the helpful type." She turned back to Grace, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Well, Miss Richardson, I'll leave you to your cleaning. Do let me know if you need any advice. I'd hate to see Constance's legacy crumble due to inexperience." After Vivian left, Grace let out a long breath. "Well, she was friendly." Zane gave a short laugh. "Don't mind Vivian. She's been the queen bee of St. Joe's business owners for a few years now. Having competition probably doesn't sit well with her, even from a dress shop when she runs a millinery." "I got the sense there was more to it than business rivalry," Grace observed. Zane looked uncomfortable. "Vivian and I. She's made it known she'd be interested in something more than friendship. I've made it clear I'm not. She doesn't take rejection well." "I see," Grace said, filing that information away. So Vivian saw her as a threat on multiple fronts. That was good to know. They returned to their work, and by noon the shop looked dramatically better. The floors were swept, the shelves dusted, the windows washed until they sparkled. Grace had found the shop's account books and was beginning to understand how Constance had run things. Zane had fixed the loose step and tightened several wobbly shelves. "I should head back," Zane said reluctantly as they stood surveying their work. "Got chores that can't wait much longer, but I can come back tomorrow if you need more help." "You've done so much already," Grace protested. "I can't keep taking up your time." "You're not taking it up, I'm offering it," Zane said firmly. "Besides, I want to see this place open again. My sister's going to be over the moon when she hears Constance's shop is coming back." Grace walked him to the door, suddenly not wanting him to leave. His presence made everything seem more manageable, more possible. Alone again, the doubts would creep back in. But she couldn't say that, couldn't cling to him like some helpless female. She'd come here to build a life, and that meant standing on her own feet. "Thank you, Zane," she said instead. "For everything. The rescue yesterday, the help today, just everything." He settled his hat on his head and gave her that slow smile that did strange things to her pulse. "Welcome to St. Joseph, Grace. I think you're going to do just fine here." After he left, Grace ate a quick lunch from supplies she'd bought from the general store that morning, then spent the afternoon going through Constance's records in detail. Her aunt had been meticulous, recording every transaction, every order, every expense. The ledgers painted a picture of a successful business that had served the community well for over 20 years. Grace found patterns in the orders, understanding what types of garments were most requested, which fabrics were most popular, how Constance had priced her work. She found sketches tucked between the pages, designs for dresses and skirts and bodices, some completed and marked with customer names, others just ideas that had never been realized. Her aunt had been an artist as well as a businesswoman. As evening approached, Grace heard another knock at the door. She opened it to find a young woman about her own age, with dark curly hair and bright blue-gray eyes that were startlingly familiar. "You must be Grace," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Rebecca Carter. Zane's my brother. He told me you'd arrived and I just had to come meet you and see if you needed anything, and oh, I'm talking too fast, aren't I? My husband always says I talk too fast when I'm excited." Grace couldn't help but smile at Rebecca's enthusiasm. "Please come in. I'm so glad to meet you. Zane mentioned you might be willing to help me learn about the shop." "Help? I'd love to." Rebecca swept inside, looking around with shining eyes. "Oh, it looks wonderful already. You've been working hard. I loved spending time here when I was younger. Miss Constance taught me so much about sewing and design. She was the reason I made my own wedding dress instead of ordering one from back east." Over the next hour, Rebecca proved to be a fountain of information. She knew which suppliers Constance had used, which customers had standing orders, which families could be counted on to pay promptly, and which needed gentle reminders. She pointed out the hidden cubbies where Constance had stored special trims and buttons, showed Grace the system for organizing patterns, explained how the local seamstresses guild worked. "You'll want to join the guild," Rebecca said firmly. "They meet twice a month at the church. It's a good way to network, and they do charity sewing for families in need. Miss Constance was a founding member." "I will," Grace promised. "Thank you so much for all of this. I feel much less lost already." Rebecca squeezed her hand. "I'm so glad you're here. And not just because we need a dress shop again, though we do, but also because—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Zane needs more good people in his life. He works too hard, takes too much on himself. It's nice to see him interested in helping someone." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, I don't think I'm anything special. He seems like the type who'd help anyone." "He is," Rebecca agreed. "But there was something in his voice when he talked about you this morning. I know my brother, you've made an impression." After Rebecca left, promising to return soon with her husband to meet Grace properly, Grace stood alone in the shop again. But this time the solitude felt different, less isolating. She'd made friends today, or at least the beginnings of friends. She had help, support, knowledge. The impossible task of reopening the shop suddenly seemed merely difficult instead. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Zane came by every few days, always finding some repair that needed doing or heavy lifting Grace couldn't manage alone. Rebecca visited often, bringing other women from town to meet Grace and spread the word that the dress shop would be reopening soon. Grace worked from dawn until well after dark, cleaning, organizing, sewing sample pieces to display in the window, practicing her skills on scraps until her fingers ached. She placed advertisements in the local newspaper announcing the shop's reopening. She introduced herself to the other merchants on 3rd Street, who were uniformly welcoming except for a few pointed silences when Vivian Sutton's name came up. Apparently, Grace wasn't the first person to experience the woman's territorial behavior. Mr. Patterson, who ran the general store next door, was particularly helpful. He was a portly man in his 50s with a white beard and kind eyes, and he'd been fond of Constance. "Your aunt was one of the first people to welcome my wife and me when we came to St. Joe 15 years ago," he told Grace. "Helped us get established, introduced us around. I'm happy to return the favor to her kin." Grace found herself settling into a routine. She woke early, worked in the shop until mid-morning, then ventured out to buy supplies or visit with other merchants, or simply walk through town to better understand her new home. St. Joseph was rough around the edges, but it had a vibrant energy that was infectious. Everyone seemed to be building something, starting something, hoping for something. It was a town of new beginnings, and that suited her perfectly. And through it all, there was Zane. He was becoming a fixture in her days, showing up with fresh eggs from his ranch, or a haunch of venison he'd hunted, or simply his quiet, steady presence. They talked as they worked together, conversations that ranged from the practical to the personal. She learned about his ranch, the Rocking Eye, which he ran with 2 hired hands and a determination to honor his father's legacy. He learned about her life in Philadelphia, the poverty and desperation that had driven her west, the hope that kept her moving forward. There was an ease between them that Grace had never experienced with a man before. Zane treated her as an equal, someone capable and intelligent, not a delicate flower to be protected or an object to be pursued. He listened when she talked, remembered details, offered advice when asked but never pushed. And when he smiled at her, which happened more and more often, she felt something warm unfurl in her chest. One particularly warm afternoon in early August, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Grace was arranging fabric samples in the shop window when Zane appeared with his toolbox. "Thought I'd fix that squeaky hinge on the front door," he announced. "It's been driving me crazy." Grace laughed. "It's been driving you crazy. You're only here a few hours a week. I hear it constantly." "Then I better fix it immediately," Zane said with exaggerated seriousness. "Can't have you going mad from squeaky hinges." As he worked, Grace continued with the window display, very aware of his presence just a few feet away. She'd been thinking about him more and more lately, in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude or friendship. She noticed things. The way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the laugh lines around his eyes, how his hands moved with such confidence and precision, the low rumble of his voice that made her feel safe. "Grace," Zane said, and she turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, her heart suddenly beating faster. He set down his tools and stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "There's a dance at the church this Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just the community getting together. Would you like to go? With me?" Grace felt a smile spreading across her face. "Are you asking me to accompany you to a dance, Zane Ingram?" "I suppose I am," he said, and she could swear his cheeks were slightly pink beneath his tan. "If you're interested, that is. No pressure, I just thought it might be nice. Give you a chance to meet more people in a more social setting." "I would love to," Grace said softly. "Thank you for asking." The relief and pleasure in Zane's expression made her heart flutter. "Good, that's good. I'll pick you up around 6 on Saturday." "I'll be ready," Grace promised. After Zane left, Grace found herself humming as she worked, a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. A dance. With Zane. It felt like something significant, a shift from friendship into territory that was both exciting and terrifying. She tried to tamp down her hopes, reminding herself that it was just a community dance, nothing to read too much into. But the flutter of anticipation in her stomach refused to be quieted. Saturday arrived sunny and hot, typical for Missouri in August. Grace spent the morning working on a dress order that had come in the day before, her first real commission since reopening. Mrs. Patterson had requested 2 everyday dresses for her daughters, and Grace was determined to do exceptional work. This would set the tone for her reputation in St. Joe. In the afternoon, she allowed herself the luxury of preparing for the evening. She drew water and heated it on the stove for a proper bath, then washed her hair and dried it in the sun on the back step. She had only a few dresses, and most were practical work garments. But she had one she'd sewn for herself during the long journey west, a blue cotton with white trim at the collar and cuffs. It was simple, but the color brought out her eyes and the fit was flattering. She was just pinning up her hair when she heard Zane's knock. Her hands trembled slightly as she secured the last few pins, took a deep breath, and went downstairs. Zane stood at the door dressed more formally than she'd ever seen him, in dark trousers and a white shirt with a vest, his boots polished and his hair neatly combed. His eyes widened when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Grace replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look very handsome yourself." He offered his arm and she took it, thrilled at the simple intimacy of the gesture. They walked through the evening streets of St. Joe toward the church, passing other couples and families heading in the same direction. The sun was lowering in the west, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the heat of the day was finally easing. The church hall was already crowded when they arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters casting warm light over the assembled townspeople. A small band, 3 men with a fiddle, banjo, and harmonica, was setting up in one corner. Long tables held food brought by various families, and children ran between the adults, laughing and playing. Grace felt suddenly nervous. This was her first real social event in St. Joe, and everyone would be watching the newcomer, evaluating her, judging whether she fit into their community. But Zane's presence beside her was steadying, and when he placed his hand at the small of her back, guiding her into the room, she felt braver. Rebecca appeared almost immediately, her face lighting up. "Grace, Zane, oh, I'm so glad you both came." She pulled a tall, lean man forward. "Grace, this is my husband, Thomas Carter. Thomas, this is Miss Grace Richardson, Constance's niece." Thomas shook her hand with a firm grip and a genuine smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Richardson. Rebecca hasn't stopped talking about you since you arrived. I feel like I already know you." "Call me Grace, please," she said. "And it's wonderful to meet you, too." More introductions followed as the evening progressed. Grace met more townspeople than she could possibly remember, though everyone was kind and welcoming. The Pattersons and their daughters, the banker and his wife, the doctor, the schoolteacher, ranch families from the surrounding area, other merchants. It was overwhelming, but in a good way, being absorbed into this community that was choosing to accept her. When the music started, Zane turned to her with a slightly nervous smile. "Would you like to dance? Fair warning, I'm not very good." "I'm not very good either," Grace admitted. "I never had much occasion to dance in Philadelphia." "Then we'll be terrible together," Zane said, offering his hand. She took it, and he led her to where other couples were forming up for a reel. The dance was lively and chaotic, with much laughter as people stumbled through the steps. Zane was right that he wasn't a polished dancer, but he was enthusiastic and laughed at himself when he went the wrong direction. Grace found herself laughing too, more freely than she had in years, caught up in the simple joy of music and movement and being young. When the reel ended, a slower waltz began. Zane pulled her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers. "Better," he said. "I can manage a waltz without making a fool of myself." This close, Grace could see the golden flecks in his blue-gray eyes, could feel the warmth of his body, could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that was becoming wonderfully familiar. They moved together, finding a rhythm, and for the first time since arriving in St. Joe, Grace felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Are you happy you came?" Zane asked softly. "To St. Joe, I mean, not just tonight." Grace thought about it, really considered the question. "Yes," she said finally. "It's been hard and I'm still learning, and sometimes I'm terrified I'm going to fail. But yes, I'm happy I came. I feel like I can breathe here, if that makes sense." "It does," Zane said. "I've never lived anywhere else, so I can't compare. But I do know that this land gives you room to be who you are, not who someone else says you should be. There's freedom in that." "There is," Grace agreed. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "And I'm especially happy I met you. I don't know how I would have managed without your help." Zane's hand tightened slightly at her waist. "I'm glad I was there that day on the stage road, glad I could help, and I'm glad you're here now." They danced several more dances, talked with other townspeople, ate food from the communal tables. At one point, Grace saw Vivian Sutton across the room, watching her and Zane with undisguised displeasure. But for once, that didn't bother Grace. Let Vivian be unhappy. Grace was too busy being content. As the evening wound down and they walked back through the quiet streets, Zane said, "I have to go up to the northern pastures tomorrow, check on the herd. I'll be gone for a few days. Will you be all right here on your own?" "Of course," Grace said, though she felt a pang of disappointment at the thought of not seeing him. "I have plenty of work to keep me busy. Mrs. Patterson's dresses plus 2 more orders came in yesterday." They reached the shop, and Grace unlocked the door. She turned to face Zane, not wanting the evening to end. "Thank you for tonight. I had a wonderful time." "So did I," Zane said. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Grace, He trailed off, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. Grace held her breath, her heart pounding. "I'm glad you came to St. Joe," he finally said, but Grace had the feeling that wasn't what he'd originally meant to say. "Get some rest. I'll see you when I get back." After he left, Grace leaned against the closed door, touching her cheek where his fingers had been. Something was growing between them, something real and precious and terrifying. She'd come to the frontier alone, seeking nothing more than survival and a chance to build a life. She hadn't expected this, hadn't been looking for it. But standing there in the darkness of her shop, Grace admitted to herself what her heart had known for days. She was falling in love with Zane Ingram. The next few days were busy ones. Grace threw herself into work, determined to prove herself to her new community. She completed the Patterson dresses ahead of schedule, and when the girls tried them on, their delighted squeals made all her effort worthwhile. Word spread, and more orders came in. A riding skirt for the doctor's wife, 3 shirts for a rancher's sons, a christening gown for a young mother. Grace sewed late into the night, her fingers flying over the fabric, creating garments that were not just functional but beautiful. She discovered she loved this work in a way she'd never loved the factory. There was creativity here, a chance to express herself and see the direct results of her labor. Each completed garment was a small triumph, proof that she could do this, that she could make a place for herself here. But even in the midst of her work, she thought about Zane. Wondered if he was safe, if the work was going well when he'd return. She found herself listening for his knock at the door, looking for his tall figure walking down the street. His absence made her realize how much space he'd come to occupy in her life and heart. Rebecca visited on the third day, bringing fresh bread and gossip. "Thomas saw Zane heading back this morning," she said with a knowing smile. "I imagine you'll be seeing him soon." "I'm sure he has plenty to do at the ranch after being away," Grace said, trying to sound casual. Rebecca laughed. "Grace, you're not fooling anyone. The whole town's been watching you too, and before you ask, yes, everyone approves. Zane deserves someone wonderful, and you're wonderful." "It's too soon to think like that," Grace protested, but she couldn't help smiling. "We're just friends." "Keep telling yourself that," Rebecca said cheerfully. "But I know my brother, and I've seen the way he looks at you. That's not friendship, Grace. That's something much deeper." Later that afternoon, as Grace was fitting a bodice for one of her customers, she heard the now familiar knock. Her heart leaped, and she had to force herself to finish pinning the garment before excusing herself to answer the door. Zane stood there, dusty from travel but smiling. "Miss me?" "Terribly," Grace said, then blushed at her own boldness. "I mean the shop missed your constant repairs. Nothing's broken without you here." "Sounds like a problem I should fix," Zane said, his eyes warm. "Are you busy? I was hoping we could talk." Grace glanced back at her customer, an older woman named Mrs. Henderson, who was watching with interest. "I need about 15 more minutes to finish this fitting. Could you wait?" "I'll wait as long as it takes," Zane said quietly, and something in his tone made Grace's pulse race. She finished with Mrs. Henderson as quickly as she could without being rude, then closed the shop. Zane was waiting outside, leaning against the wall, his hat in his hands. "Want to walk?" he asked. "There's something I want to show you." Grace nodded, and they walked through town toward the river. The Missouri flowed broad and brown, carrying its endless freight of water toward some distant sea. The riverbank was quieter here, away from the docks and warehouses, with tall cottonwood trees providing shade. Zane led her to a spot where someone had placed a bench overlooking the water. They sat, and for a moment he was silent, turning his hat in his hands. "Grace," he finally said, "I've been thinking a lot the past few days, about you, about us, about what I want." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "And what do you want?" He turned to face her fully. I want you. I know it's only been a few weeks and maybe that's too fast and you have every right to tell me I'm being ridiculous, but I've never felt like this before. When I'm with you, everything makes sense. And when I'm not with you, all I can think about is getting back to you." Grace felt tears pricking her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Zane, I feel the same way. I came here expecting nothing, hoping only to survive. But you've given me so much more. You've made me feel safe and valued and seen in a way I never have before." Zane reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I don't have much to offer. The ranch is doing all right, but it's hard work and there's no guarantee. Life out here is rough. But I would do everything in my power to make you happy, to give you a good life, if you'd be willing to try, with me." "Are you asking me to court you, Zane Ingram?" Grace asked, her voice shaky with emotion. "I suppose I am," he said with that smile she'd come to love. "Assuming you're interested in being courted by a rough cowboy who can't dance and spends most of his time covered in dust." "I can't think of anything I'd like more," Grace whispered. Zane's face lit up with joy. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "You've made me so happy. Happier than I've been in a long time." They sat together on the bench as the sun lowered, talking about everything and nothing. Zane told her about his dreams for the ranch, expanding the herd, maybe buying more land. Grace shared her hopes for the dress shop, eventually taking on an apprentice, maybe opening a second location someday. They talked about their families, their childhoods, the wounds and joys that had shaped them. "My father would have liked you," Zane said at one point. He always said the best people were the ones who'd been through hard times and come out still believing in goodness. That's you. Your mother would have liked you, Grace replied. Anyone would be lucky to have a son like you. As darkness fell and they finally walked back toward town, Zane kept hold of her hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt momentous. They were courting now, officially, publicly. Everyone would know. And Grace found she didn't care about the gossip or speculation. She was proud to be with Zane, proud that he'd chosen her. At her door he hesitated, then leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "Good night, Grace. Sleep well." "Good night, Zane," she whispered. The next weeks passed in a haze of happiness. Zane courted her properly, calling on her at the shop, taking her on picnics by the river, escorting her to church on Sundays. The whole town knew they were together, and most people seemed genuinely pleased. Rebecca was ecstatic, already planning hypothetical futures that made Grace blush and laugh. The dress shop thrived. Grace's reputation for quality work spread, and customers came from miles around. She was making enough money not just to survive but to save, to think about the future with real hope. She joined the Seamstresses Guild and made friends among the other women. She was becoming part of the community, no longer the stranger from back east but simply Grace, the dressmaker, Zane's girl. But not everyone was happy about the developments. Vivian Sutton grew increasingly hostile, making pointed comments about opportunistic Easterners and women who trapped men. Grace tried to ignore it, but the barbs stung. One afternoon in late September, Vivian came into the shop when Grace was alone. "I hope you're pleased with yourself," Vivian said without preamble. Grace looked up from her sewing. "I'm sorry, Zane. You've certainly worked fast, haven't you? Barely 2 months in town and you've got your hooks into one of the most eligible men in the county." Grace set down her needle carefully, keeping her temper in check. "Zane and I care about each other. I haven't trapped anyone." "Please," Vivian said with a harsh laugh. "You show up with nothing, play the helpless female, and Zane, with his overdeveloped sense of responsibility, comes running. It's manipulative and everyone can see it." "That's not what happened and you know it," Grace said, standing up. "I'm sorry if you're upset that Zane isn't interested in you, but that's between you and him. It has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you," Vivian hissed. "He was perfectly content before you arrived. We could have had something. But then you come along with your sad story and your wide eyes, and suddenly he can't see anyone else." "Zane made his own choices," Grace said firmly. "And those choices were made long before I arrived." "I'm sorry you're hurting, truly, but you need to leave now." Vivian stared at her for a long moment, something ugly twisting her beautiful face. "You think you've won, but this is a small town, Grace. Reputations can be destroyed so easily, be careful." After she left, Grace sank back into her chair, shaking. She didn't believe Vivian would actually try to damage her reputation, but the encounter had rattled her. She'd thought the worst was behind her, that she'd found her place here. But apparently, some battles were ongoing. When Zane came by that evening, she told him about the confrontation. His face darkened with anger. "I'll talk to her," he said. "This has to stop." "No," Grace said, putting a hand on his arm. "That will only make it worse. She's hurt and lashing out. Eventually, she'll accept the situation and move on." "I don't like the idea of her threatening you," Zane said, his jaw tight. "I can handle Vivian Sutton," Grace said with more confidence than she felt. "I've dealt with much worse in my life. A jealous woman isn't going to drive me away from my home or the man I love." The words were out before she'd thought about them, and Grace froze. They'd been courting for a month, but neither had said those words yet. It was too soon, too fast, too much. But Zane's face softened into the most tender expression she'd ever seen. "You love me," Grace swallowed hard. Yes, I do. I probably shouldn't. It's too soon, and we've only known each other a short time, and I didn't mean to say it out loud, but yes, I love you. Zane pulled her into his arms, holding her close. I love you too, Grace. I've loved you since the first week, maybe since that first day when you stood in this dusty shop and lifted your chin and declared you were going to make it work despite being terrified. You're the bravest, strongest, most wonderful woman I've ever met. Grace buried her face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling his heart beat steady and strong. So what do we do now? Now, Zane pulled back just enough to look at her face. Now I ask you to marry me. Grace's breath caught. What? Marry me, Zane repeated. I know it's fast, but out here people don't waste time when they find something real. I want you as my wife, Grace. I want to build a life with you, a family. I want to wake up next to you every morning and come home to you every evening. I want everything with you. Tears were streaming down Grace's face now. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. There's nothing I want more. Zane kissed her then, their first real kiss, and it was everything Grace had dreamed of. Gentle but passionate, tender but full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, grinning at each other like idiots. How soon? Zane asked. I don't want a long engagement. I've waited long enough already. Neither do I, Grace said. A month, is that too fast? A month is perfect, Zane said, kissing her again. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. Rebecca appointed herself chief organizer, determined to give her brother and new sister to be the wedding they deserved. The ceremony would be at the church, followed by a reception in the hall. Grace would wear a dress of her own making, ivory silk she'd been hoarding for something special. Zane would wear his best suit, cleaned and pressed. It would be simple but meaningful, surrounded by the community that had welcomed her. Grace threw herself into finishing all her outstanding orders so she'd have time for the wedding dress, and a few days away afterward. Zane was planning a short honeymoon trip to Kansas City, the farthest Grace would have traveled since arriving in Missouri. She was excited and nervous and happier than she'd ever been, but one worry nagged at her. She hadn't heard from Vivian since that confrontation, and the silence felt ominous. Several times she'd caught sight of the woman watching her from across the street, an unreadable expression on her face. Grace told herself she was being paranoid, that Vivian had simply accepted defeat and moved on. But the unease persisted. 2 weeks before the wedding, Grace was working late in the shop, putting the finishing touches on her wedding dress. She was alone, having sent Rebecca home an hour ago despite her friend's protests. The dress was nearly complete, and Grace wanted a few moments alone with it, to contemplate the new life it represented. She was so absorbed in her sewing that she didn't hear the back door open, didn't sense anyone approaching until a hand clamped over her mouth, and she was jerked backward out of her chair. Grace struggled, trying to scream, but the hand was firm. Then she heard a voice in her ear, male and unfamiliar. Stay quiet and you won't get hurt. Just want your money and we'll be on our way. Terror flooded through her. The shop's receipts were in a cash box under the counter, several weeks' worth of earnings that she'd been planning to deposit at the bank the next day. But more frightening than the money was the man's presence, the sense of danger radiating from him. A second man appeared from the back room, also masked. "Find it?" the one holding her asked. "Not yet," the other replied, rifling through drawers. Grace tried to think past her fear. If they took the money, she'd lose weeks of income, but she'd survive. Material things could be replaced. But what if they wanted more than money? What if they decided she was a witness who couldn't be left behind? The man searching found the cash box and crowed in triumph. "Got it. Good," the one holding her said. "Let's go." But as they moved toward the back door, the front door opened. Zane walked in, calling out, "Grace, you still here?" Everything happened so fast. The man holding Grace released her and drew a knife. Zane saw the intruders and reached for his gun. The second man grabbed a bolt of fabric and threw it, knocking Zane's arm aside. Grace screamed, diving for the scissors on her work table. The man with the knife lunged at Zane. There was a brief, violent struggle. Grace swung the scissors at the second man, more in panic than with any real aim, but the blade caught his arm and he yelped, stumbling back. Then Zane had his gun out and fired into the ceiling. The deafening crack froze everyone. "Get out," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Now, before I decide to aim lower." The two men bolted, leaving the cash box behind in their haste. Grace heard their footsteps pounding away into the night. Then her knees gave out and she sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Zane was beside her instantly, holstering his gun and gathering her into his arms. "You're all right. You're safe. I've got you." "They came in through the back," Grace sobbed against his chest. "I didn't hear them." "They wanted money. I thought they might." You're all right," Zane murmured, holding her tight. "You're safe now." Other people arrived, drawn by the gunshot. Mr. Patterson from next door, the sheriff, curious townspeople. Grace gave her statement in a trembling voice, described the men as best she could, though the masks had hidden their features. The sheriff promised to investigate, though his expression suggested he didn't hold out much hope of catching them. After everyone left and the shop was locked up tight, Zane insisted on taking Grace back to the ranch rather than leaving her alone in town. She was too shaken to protest. She gathered a few things and let him help her up into his wagon, then leaned against him as they drove through the dark Missouri night. The Rocking Eye Ranch was about 5 miles north of St. Joe, nestled in a valley with good water and better grazing. The house was modest, a sturdy wooden structure with a wide porch and rooms enough for a family. Zane carried her inside and settled her in the main room while he lit lamps and stoked the fire in the stove. "I should make coffee," Grace said, trying to pull herself together. "You should sit still and let me take care of you," Zane said firmly. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of whiskey instead of coffee. "Drink. It will help with the shock." Grace sipped the burning liquid, feeling it spread warmth through her cold limbs. Zane sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, solid and reassuring. "I keep thinking what might have happened if you hadn't come in when you did," Grace whispered. "But I did come in," Zane said. "And you're safe, that's what matters." "Why did you come by? You usually don't visit that late." "Had a feeling," Zane said simply. "Something told me I needed to check on you. Thank God I listened." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the night sounds of the ranch filtering in through the windows. Grace felt her panic gradually subsiding, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. "Stay here tonight," Zane said. "You can have my room, I'll sleep out here." "I don't want to be alone," Grace admitted quietly. "Could you just stay with me, just to sleep? I just need to know you're there." Zane looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure? It wouldn't be proper." "I don't care about proper right now," Grace said. "I care about feeling safe. Please." So they lay together on Zane's bed, fully clothed, Grace curled against his chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her. She fell asleep feeling safer than she had since before the attack, lulled by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the warmth of his embrace. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of roosters crowing. Grace woke disoriented, then remembered where she was and why. Zane was still there, awake, watching her with worried eyes. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. "Better," Grace said, and realized it was true. The terror of the night before had faded to a manageable fear. She was shaken but not broken. "Thank you for letting me stay." "Thank you for trusting me," Zane replied. He brushed hair back from her face. Grace, I don't think you should stay alone above the shop anymore, not until those men are caught. I can't abandon the shop, Grace protested. I have orders to fill, a business to run. I'm not suggesting you abandon it, but you could stay here, ride into town each day with me. Or Rebecca's house, she'd be happy to have you. Just somewhere you're not alone and vulnerable. Grace wanted to argue, to insist she'd be fine, but she couldn't. The attack had frightened her badly, and the thought of being alone in that building at night made her stomach clench with anxiety. Maybe Rebecca's, she said finally. Just until after the wedding. Speaking of which, we should probably move up the date. I don't want to wait any more. Zane's smile was like sunrise. Neither do I. How about next Saturday? That's just 1 week. Can it be arranged that quickly? We'll make it work, Grace said firmly. I'm marrying you next Saturday, Zane Ingram, even if I have to wear my everyday dress and we have the ceremony in the barn. He laughed and kissed her forehead. You'll wear your beautiful wedding dress and we'll marry in the church. Rebecca and I will make sure of it. Grace moved into Rebecca and Thomas's spare room that day. Rebecca was delighted to have her, and Grace was grateful for the company and protection. She continued working at the shop during the day, but Zane or Thomas walked her there in the morning and back in the evening. The sheriff had no leads on the attackers, which frustrated everyone but wasn't entirely surprising. St. Joe saw plenty of drifters and opportunistic criminals. What did surprise Grace was a visit from Vivian Sutton 3 days after the attack. The woman appeared at the shop mid-morning, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "May I speak with you?" Vivian asked. Grace almost refused, but something in the other woman's demeanor made her relent. "Come in." Vivian entered and stood awkwardly in the middle of the shop. "I heard about what happened. The attack." "News travels fast," Grace said neutrally. "I came to say." Vivian paused, clearly struggling. "I came to say I'm sorry for how I've treated you. And to assure you I had nothing to do with those men." Grace studied her. "I never thought you did." "Didn't you?" Vivian met her eyes. "I made threats. I was hateful. You had every reason to suspect me. Being jealous and bitter doesn't make you a criminal," Grace said quietly. "I've been hurt too, Vivian. I know how it feels to want something you can't have, to see someone else get what you wanted. I don't hate you for it." Vivian's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "You're being much kinder than I deserve." "Maybe," Grace agreed. "But I've learned that carrying anger only hurts the person carrying it. I'd rather let it go." Vivian wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "For what it's worth, Zane never gave me any reason to hope. I built up expectations in my own mind. It wasn't his fault and it wasn't yours. I was just so sure that if I waited long enough, he'd eventually see me. But he never did, because he was waiting for someone like you." "I hope you find your own happiness," Grace said sincerely. "You're a beautiful, successful woman. The right person is out there somewhere." After Vivian left, Grace felt lighter somehow. She'd made peace with her only real enemy in St. Joe, removed that source of conflict from her life. Everything was falling into place. The wedding preparations took on new urgency with the accelerated timeline. Grace worked frantically to finish her dress, staying up late at Rebecca's house to complete the intricate beading and lacework. Rebecca helped organize the church and reception, refusing to let Grace worry about any of it. Thomas and Zane handled the practical details, arranging for Grace's shop to be closed for a few days and ensuring the ranch would run smoothly in their brief absence. The night before the wedding, Grace had dinner with Rebecca and Thomas. Zane had stayed at the ranch, adhering to the tradition of not seeing the bride the night before. "Nervous?" Rebecca asked as they cleaned up after the meal. "Terrified," Grace admitted. "But in a good way. I keep thinking about how different my life is from where it was just 4 months ago. I was so lost, so hopeless. And now I'm marrying the most wonderful man I've ever met. I have a thriving business, friends, a home. It feels like a dream." "It's not a dream," Rebecca said warmly, hugging her. "It's your life, the life you've built and earned. And tomorrow you're going to marry my brother and become my official sister, and I couldn't be happier about it." That night, Grace lay in bed at Rebecca's house and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The factory work and poverty in Philadelphia, the desperation that had driven her west, the long stage-coach journey, the attack and rescue that had brought Zane into her life. Every hardship, every struggle had led her to this moment. She'd come to the frontier alone, seeking only survival. But she'd found so much more. Her wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, a perfect September morning with a hint of autumn in the air. Rebecca helped her dress, fastening the dozens of tiny buttons on the ivory silk gown Grace had made with her own hands. Grace looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the radiant woman staring back. "You're beautiful," Rebecca whispered, tears in her eyes. "Zane's going to lose his mind when he sees you." The church was full when they arrived. It seemed like half of St. Joe had turned out for the wedding. Grace saw Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, the members of the Seamstresses Guild, customers and merchants and ranch families. Even Vivian was there, seated near the back, offering a small smile when their eyes met. But Grace only had eyes for Zane, standing at the altar in his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his face shining with such love and joy that it took her breath away. Thomas stood beside him as best man, grinning widely. The ceremony was simple but profound. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other, to stand together through whatever life brought. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Zane kissed her with such tenderness that Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. The reception was a joyous blur. There was food and music and dancing. Grace danced with Zane, with Thomas, with Mr. Patterson, and half a dozen other men from town. She laughed with Rebecca and the other women, accepted congratulations and well wishes, and through it all felt Zane's eyes on her, warm and loving and full of promise. As evening fell, they said their goodbyes and climbed into Zane's wagon for the ride back to the ranch. They'd leave for Kansas City in the morning, but tonight they'd spend at the Rocking Eye, in the home that was now Grace's as much as Zane's. The house was quiet when they arrived, the hired hands discreetly absent. Zane lit lamps and stoked the fire while Grace stood in the middle of the main room, suddenly nervous. "So this is home now," she said softly. "This is home," Zane agreed, coming to stand before her. "If you want it to be, we could add on, make it bigger. Or build a new house closer to town if you'd prefer. Whatever you want." "I want this," Grace said. "I want you, that's all I need." Zane cupped her face in his hands. "I love you, Grace Ingram." "I love you too," she whispered. Their wedding night was everything Grace had hoped for, tender and passionate and perfect. Afterward, lying in Zane's arms in the darkness, Grace thought about how far she'd come. She'd arrived in St. Joe alone, frightened, uncertain, but she wasn't alone anymore. She'd never be alone again. The trip to Kansas City was wonderful. 3 days of exploring the bustling city, staying in a real hotel, eating in restaurants, and simply enjoying being newlyweds. But Grace was glad when they returned to the ranch. Missouri had become her home, and she was eager to return to the life they were building together. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Grace continued running the dress shop, but now she had Zane to come home to each evening. They'd have dinner together, talk about their days, make plans for the future. On Sundays, they'd attend church and have dinner with Rebecca and Thomas. Grace joined more community organizations, becoming an integral part of St. Joe's social fabric. Winter came and went, then spring. In early May, Grace discovered she was pregnant. Zane's joy was boundless, and he immediately became overprotective, worrying about her working too hard or riding the wagon to town over rough roads. Grace found his concern endearing even when it was excessive. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she'd laugh when he tried to carry her over a puddle or insisted she rest when she felt perfectly fine. "I know," he'd reply, "but you're carrying the most precious thing in the world to me. Let me fuss a little." She did let him fuss, because she loved him and because secretly she enjoyed being cared for so completely. The baby grew, and so did their happiness. Grace closed the shop a month before her due date, having trained a young woman named Sarah as her assistant. Sarah would manage things while Grace took time for the baby, ensuring the business continued even in her absence. Their son was born on a hot July night in 1876, almost exactly a year after Grace had arrived in St. Joe. The labor was long and difficult, but Rebecca and the doctor were there, and most importantly Zane was there, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Zane wept openly. "A son," he breathed, cradling the tiny bundle. "We have a son." They named him James after Zane's father. Little James was the pride of the ranch, doted on by everyone. Zane was a devoted father, coming in from the field several times a day just to hold his son, singing to him in his rough voice, showing him everything about the ranch even though the baby was far too young to understand. Grace returned to the shop part-time when James was 3 months old, bringing him with her in a cradle by the counter. Customers loved seeing the baby, and business was better than ever. The dress shop was now firmly established as the best in the county, and Grace's reputation as a skilled seamstress had spread far beyond St. Joe. 2 years later, their daughter was born, a little girl they named Constance after Grace's aunt. Constance was quieter than James had been, more observant with Zane's blue-gray eyes and Grace's blonde hair. She seemed to study everything around her with serious intensity even as an infant. Their family was complete, their life full and happy. The ranch prospered, and so did the shop. Grace and Zane were pillars of the community, respected and loved. Rebecca and Thomas had 2 children of their own, and the cousins grew up together, running wild on the ranch during summer visits. Years passed in a blur of happiness. Grace watched James grow into a strong, kind boy who loved the ranch as much as his father did. She watched Constance develop a talent for drawing and design, often sitting beside Grace at the shop and sketching dresses even at 5 years old. She watched Zane age gracefully, still strong and capable but with silver threading through his dark hair and deeper lines around his eyes. On a September evening in 1881, 6 years after their wedding, Grace and Zane sat on their porch watching the sunset. James, now 5, was playing with his toy horses in the yard. Constance, 3, was asleep on Grace's lap. "You ever regret it?" Zane asked. "Coming west, leaving everything behind?" Grace looked at him in surprise. "Regret? How could I possibly regret any of it? This life, this family, you. You're everything I never knew I needed." Zane smiled and took her free hand. "I just want to make sure you're happy, that you don't feel like you gave up too much." "I gave up a life that was killing me slowly," Grace said, "and I gained everything that makes life worth living." "I'm happier than I ever imagined possible, Zane. Because of you, because you made sure I was never alone." "You were never meant to be alone," Zane said, squeezing her hand. "From the moment I saw you on that stagecoach, I knew. You were meant to be here with me, building this life together." Grace leaned against his shoulder, careful not to wake Constance. "I love you, Zane Ingram. I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you, Grace Ingram," he murmured against her hair. "Always and forever." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the Missouri sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Grace thought about the frightened, desperate woman who'd arrived in St. Joe 6 years ago. That woman had been alone, uncertain, afraid of the future. But she'd found her courage, built her business, and opened her heart to love. She'd come to the frontier alone, seeking only survival. But the cowboy she'd met that first day had made sure she'd never be alone again, and together they'd built something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to unfold in joy and occasional sorrow, as all lives do. There were hard winters and dry summers, economic downturns and personal losses. But through it all, Grace and Zane faced everything together, their love the foundation on which their entire life was built. James grew into a fine young man, taking over more responsibilities at the ranch as Zane's hair turned fully silver. He had his father's steady nature and his mother's compassionate heart. Constance, true to her early promise, became a talented designer, working alongside Grace in the dress shop and eventually taking it over entirely as Grace retired. Rebecca and Thomas remained close, their families intertwined. Sunday dinners at the ranch were raucous affairs with children and grandchildren running everywhere. The house that had once been so quiet now filled with life and laughter. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Zane surprised Grace with a trip back east to Philadelphia. It was her first time returning since she'd left, and she was shocked by how foreign it all felt. The narrow streets, the factory smoke, the crowds, everything that had once been her entire world now seemed small and confining. She was glad to see it again, to lay some old ghosts to rest. But she was even gladder to return home to Missouri, to the wide open spaces and big skies that had become part of her soul. "I don't know how I ever lived there," she told Zane as their train pulled into St. Joseph. "It feels like someone else's life now." "It was someone else," Zane said. "You're not that frightened factory girl anymore. You're Grace Ingram, successful businesswoman, beloved wife and mother, pillar of the community. You've become exactly who you were meant to be." As they rode home to the ranch, passing familiar landmarks and waving to neighbors, Grace reflected on the truth of Zane's words. She had become someone new in Missouri, or perhaps she'd finally become her true self. The life she'd built here with Zane was more than she'd ever dreamed possible in those desperate days in Philadelphia. The shop thrived under Constance's management, bringing in a steady income that supplemented the ranch. James married a sweet girl from town and brought her home to the ranch, and soon Grace and Zane were grandparents. The cycle of life continued, each generation building on what came before. Grace never forgot those early days, though. The terror of the stagecoach attack, the overwhelming uncertainty of arriving in a strange town, the desperate hope as she'd opened the door to her aunt's shop. And most of all, she never forgot Zane appearing like Providence itself, steady and kind and true. He'd saved her that first day on the stage road, but he'd kept saving her every day since. Not because she needed saving, but because that was who he was. A man who helped, who protected, who loved with his whole heart. On a crisp October morning in 1895, 20 years after they'd met, Grace woke to find Zane already up and dressed, standing at the bedroom window looking out over the ranch. She joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky I am," Zane said simply. "I have everything a man could want. A beautiful wife I love more every day, children and grandchildren, a home and land I'm proud of. My life is full, Grace, because of you." "Because of us," Grace corrected. "We built this life together." They stood there watching the sunrise together, as they'd done thousands of times before and would do thousands of times more. The ranch was peaceful in the early light, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney, horses moving in the corrals, the land stretching out endlessly in all directions. Grace thought about the journey that had brought her here, every twist and turn of fate that had led to this moment. If she hadn't inherited the shop, if she hadn't taken that stagecoach, if Zane hadn't been riding that road on that particular day, everything would be different. But all those things had happened, and she was here, and her life was more than she'd ever imagined. She'd come to the frontier alone, a desperate woman seeking nothing more than survival. But she'd found love, home, family, purpose. She'd found herself. And the cowboy who'd rescued her that first day had made sure she'd never be alone again, standing beside her through everything, his love the constant she could always count on. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Zane replied, kissing the top of her head. "Always have, always will." As the sun climbed higher and the ranch came fully to life around them, Grace felt a deep sense of contentment. This was her life. These were her people. This was her home. She'd traveled so far from that Philadelphia factory girl, crossed so many miles and overcome so many obstacles. But she'd made it. She'd built something beautiful and lasting, a life worth living, a love worth having. And she'd never been alone since that day Zane Ingram rode into her life and made sure she never would be again. Together, they'd created a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, passed down through their children and grandchildren. The dress shop would remain in the family, and so would the ranch, both testaments to what two people could build when they loved each other and refused to give up. Grace had come to the frontier seeking a new beginning. What she'd found was home. What she'd found was love. What she'd found was everything she'd ever needed, but never knew she wanted. And it all started with a cowboy on a dusty Missouri road who saw a woman who needed help and decided to give it, never knowing that simple act of kindness would change both their lives forever. Their story wasn't one of grand adventures or dramatic rescues, though it had started with both. It was a story of quiet devotion, of two people choosing each other every day, of building a life one decision at a time. It was a story of love growing deeper with each passing year, roots sinking down into the prairie soil until they were as much a part of the land as the grass and sky. And when Grace and Zane were old, their hair white and their faces lined with the years, they'd still sit on that porch watching the sunset, their hands clasped together. They'd watch their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had played. They'd talk about the past and the future, about the ranch and the shop, about all the moments big and small that had made up their life together. And Grace would sometimes think back to that terrified young woman stepping off the stagecoach in St. Joseph, alone and uncertain and desperately hoping for a miracle. She'd gotten her miracle, just not in the way she'd expected. Her miracle had blue-gray eyes and calloused hands and a heart big enough to love her exactly as she was. Her miracle made sure she was never alone again and loved her faithfully for all their days. That was their story, simple and profound, particular to them but universal in its truth. Love could heal, home could be found, and sometimes the best things in life came from taking a leap of faith into the unknown. Grace had leaped, and Zane had been there to catch her. Together, they'd built something that would last forever, a love story written into the very fabric of the frontier, as enduring as the Missouri River and as vast as the prairie sky. And they lived that love every single day, in big gestures and small moments, until their final breaths and beyond. Their legacy of love passed down through the generations. a testament to what was possible when two souls found each other against all odds and chose to build a life together.